Good evening and welcome everyone to Alma's monthly webisode series. And firstly, wishing every one of you a very happy Diwali in advance. Wishing you, your family, all your loved ones happy and a prosperous new year. And let there be peace and prosperity in the time to come. This is from me and my entire team at Almas. Welcome once again. My name is Maulik Shah. I'm one of the co-founder and a CEO of Almas Risk Consulting. Almas is in the business of managing risk for the corporate clients, especially. Those are financial risk, which is currency, commodity, and interest rate risk. And we take pride in stating that we are the pioneers in FX outsourcing in India way back in 2012. Uh, Almas monthly episode series is our endeavor, our commitment to share the knowledge that we have with us, spread the awareness about the relevant topics, the subjects with all of you. And I think in that commitment that we have, you all play a very important role. And I can tell you one thing, and really I want to thank each and every one of you who are there today. And we are just having more and more participants logging in. Your enthusiasm, your excitement really encourages us to keep coming back every month with the relevant topics. So thank you all very much taking time out of your busy schedule, being here on a webinar. Regarding today's topic, which is eighth in the series, the topic is geopolitics, and a little bit background about the topic and the curation of this topic before I come to the Professor Nalapat's brief introduction, which he has said very clearly not to introduce him, mainly because he doesn't want to take your time in me introducing him. But nevertheless, I'm going to say something about him. But before that, the topic, I think 7th October is all that it started. While I'm saying it started, we will know from Professor Nalapat where actually it started. But I'm saying 7th October is the day in which Hamas attacked Israel. And immediately after a week, and I was out with my friends on a weekend, and we saw the headlines, news items, and we all had some discussions. And I can tell you very honestly, all of us had a view, but no basis of that view, because the understanding, the knowledge was very limited, shallow, I would say. And when it comes to coming back to Bombay and when we interact with the clients, the banks, we are talking on the subject, and that's where I thought that why don't we have really someone who can give us some insights, the relevant inputs, which will at least help us form the opinion, if not anything else. And I think that's where the entire session was curated. And the first person who came to my mind was Professor Nalapat, simply because I had heard him immediately after Russia-Ukraine crisis in person in one of our session at Lonavala in L&T Center. And I was very keen that he says yes. And to my surprise, he was so receptive, very kind and humble. Thank you so much, Professor Nalapat. We are really fortunate to have you here. Just a brief introduction. He probably is one of the best to deliver the insights, the relevant inputs on the subject that we currently have. He has been, you will probably find him extensively on various news channels, on the media, Sunday Guardian, he is an editor. He is first, I will just say one word, sir. I know I'm not going to say more, but he was appointed India's first professor of geopolitics and of the UNESCO Peace Chair by Manipal University in way back in 1999. And that's really his book, Cold War 2.0. A lot of what he shares today, probably you can even find that out. I'm still reading this book. And I mean, there are a lot more which you will know in the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Professor, I really want to invite you with this brief background. The participants that you see here, and they are still coming in, they are all from different backgrounds. I can tell you the knowledge and the insight that we will have on the subject, it will be definitely useful for all of us. What I am going to create with the entire participants is that as the session progresses, you may have a questions. Like I have many questions, and I'll keep putting it across to the professor. Feel free to put your questions on the chat box. I will pick it up and curate it for professor, but do not hesitate. Don't even think about whether it's a smart question or a dumb question. Probably I'm the most dumb here on the subject. Feel free. And we will hear from professor, his insights on the subject. So the session is open. Use your chat box, and anytime during the session, we will have this session up to 6. and let it be a free-flowing conversation. Professor, welcome to the Almas webinar series, and thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much, Maulik. The fact is that your the field of activity is very, very important for the economy. In fact, many people, even in the levels of policy, do not understand how important the financial markets are for economic growth and, for example, for startup culture, for innovation. Because the whole, let's say, for example, you have an innovative idea. It's of absolutely no value unless you have finance. So it's like having an excellent seed and not having water to basically nourish that particular seed. So I think, in that sense, system of canals, waterways, etc., a good financial system, a transparent financial system, a straightforward financial system, which works well and which also recognizes talent and potential rather than simply established names or, yesterday's champions, today's semi-champions, but they may be tomorrow's losers. So you have to recognize tomorrow's champions today, and that's your job in the financial market. So actually, it's an honor for me to be told by Maulik that there is something I can teach you, when the fact is that I'm not even in KG where finance is concerned. I would say I'm illiterate. So as I said, Maulik, the point is it's a Q&A session.
Yes.
I don't want to give a talk. We have all seen as you correctly said, it took place, the kinetic series of events took place on October 7 with this terror attack by Hamas.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say that Hamas is a terror organization that took control of the Gaza Strip in 2007. Now, the fact is that you have Hamas and you have the Palestinian Authority. And very unwisely, many of Israel, they thought Hamas was not really going to be a problem. It was only controlled a small area of territory. That area was more or less dominated by Israel. And at the same time, the Palestinian Authority was established all over the world, diplomatic offices in India from the very beginning. We recognized the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate voice of the partition state of Palestine. You have Israel and you have Palestine. Like in India, you had India and then you had Pakistan. So you have the Indian state. So we recognize Palestine from the very beginning. So from that point of view, I'm afraid the Israelis misjudged Hamas very, very badly. And there were, of course, instances Hamas really was very active and they launched terror attacks, and they were immediately put down by the Israeli side. Now, of course, that in brief is the situation. In my own personal view, that was a mistake, because Hamas, the terror organization, the Palestine, the PA, the Palestinian administration, is a legitimate organization wedded to nonviolence. Hamas is wedded to violence. And I'm really surprised that anybody who looks at the charter of Hamas, I'm sure you can find it on the net. The whole thing is about destroying the state of Israel. And the whole thing is basically about, implicitly about destroying the Jewish community on earth. The Israelis made the same mistake that the Americans, I think, made where 9/11 was concerned, where you had these fanatics, and they were having their pamphlets. In these pamphlets, they're very clear. The West is the enemy. America is the great Satan. It was a little Satan. The Europeans are horrible people. And it's our task to destroy their civilization, destroy their people, and etc., etc. Now, it's amazing that for so long before 9/11, there was the coziest of relationships between what I would call Wahhabism. I would distinguish Wahhabism from Sunni Islam. It's very different. Just as I distinguish Khomainism from Shia Islam, it's very different. Sunni Islam and Shia Islam are two schools of Islam. Wahhabism and Khomainism pretend to be part of that, but they're really not. So the Americans woke up, to the reality And if only they had read these pamphlets the way some of us had, if only they had heard some of their speeches, and many of their talks were, of course, in different languages online, and they were all concentrating on the destruction of Western civilization, mainly, and principally the destruction of the United States. And yet, you'll be surprised, Maulik, I went to the US 3 times before 9/11, the year of 9/11, because I've got a small research team. We had information from friends in Afghanistan, and we have a very large Afghan community in India whose relatives were there in Afghanistan, that some major attack was coming to the United States by what was now called widely Al-Qaeda, non-Afghan elements quartered in Afghanistan. I went there 2 times, and second time I met people who were the staffers of congressional committees, etc. Nobody really bothered. They said, well, no, I don't think so. In fact, the day before 9/11, my wife and I were in New York, a few miles away from 9/11, in what was at that time called the Lexington Hotel. And the previous day, I had gone to a very distinguished professor. I'm not going to name him, it's embarrassing. And I told him, look, your own city may face an attack from these people. And he said, what are you saying? New York is the safest city in the world. The very next day, 9/11 happened. So I'd like to say that I think a similar wake-up call came from the Israelis, who have really, frankly, ignored the central reality that Hamas is a terror organization completely committed to the destruction of not just Israel, but the Jewish people.
So going back to 7th October, Professor, and all that we saw was an attack which took Israel by surprise. And those who know anything about Israel, one of the questions that everyone has is that how come a country as tech-savvy as Israel can miss any of these indications? What really was a big miss? If you can throw some light on that, sir.
Maulik, we do research into these activities and research through mining data sources. And our research came up with the fact that this was an extremely sophisticated operation from the point of view of mapping out what was happening on the other side. Now, Israel and the Israeli intelligence had put a certain bandwidth to work on Hamas. That bandwidth was for a relatively low-tech organization with relatively low-tech capabilities. It was not really a bandwidth sufficient to take in the kind of sophisticated, if I may say so, data mining, the kind of sophisticated surveillance, the kind of sophisticated electronic interception that went into the data flow received by Hamas, which is why the conclusion that we reached was that Hamas has some days after immediately after the attack, I said that there is evidence, and because we have been tracking this actually for some weeks, about one particular country being very active in Gaza, that there was a superpower sponsor behind it. So the fact is, the Israelis basically used the bandwidth necessary to deal with a relatively low-tech, low intensity in terms of capability organization, not taking into account the reality that that organization, through various alliances, had linked up with a tech superpower who was also an economic superpower. So let's say, for example, I have a problem coming at me from 180 degrees. I have a searchlight that goes 90 degrees. It's great, but it's not enough. On either side, I'm unprotected. The way, for example, Rajiv Gandhi was, in Sriperumbudur, behind the stage, it's all dark. There was absolutely no, and even in front of him, frankly, there was, finally there was pell-mell crowding into the arena. Absolutely no checking at all. So what I want to say is that the Israelis assumed that by itself. When that assumption proved to be fatally flawed, the fatal consequences of that attack took place for more than 1,400 unfortunate, innocent civilian victims of terror in Israel.
So, do you see that as a straight away impacting? Because if it is a wake up call for Israel, I'm sure likewise it is for most of the countries. And the direct impact of that could be, you increase the defense spend, you increase your high tech, spend on the entire protections and the security. Uh, are you then saying or seeing it as the trend that can emerge? And we already saw it post Russia-Ukraine war, where European countries already started allocating billions of dollars for defense. Is that really the trend moving forward?
Look, I'd like to say, Maulik, that defense has both a cost and a benefit, and the benefit is the technological spin-off. It was unfortunate that for successive governments in India, Prime Minister Modi rectified that, did not allow defense exports. And unfortunately, over about 40, 45 years, in fact, more than that, we have become more and more reliant on external sources for our imports. And one of the reasons was the private sector was basically, told by the government, stay away from this field. It's reserved for the government. And when government money, it means there's hardly any investment in defense to meet our own domestic needs. So if you have a thriving defense export sector, believe me, it can be very valuable. So far as India is concerned, I think we have a fairly good tech base. We have the NTRO, for example. We have private institutions. We have a very good tech base. And as a consequence, I don't think that we would have been in that position. But the point is, the Israelis also a very, very sophisticated tech base. The only point is that the bandwidth beaming on Gaza was really not enough in the additional challenge and the additional capability of Hamas. So I'd like to say, defense is not in any way. It's a job multiplier. It's an income multiplier. It's a growth multiplier if the policies are right.
Let me take a step back and go back to 7th October. And I made a comment that this is where it all started. And I also said that let's get Professor inside. So where actually it started? I mean, what we saw on 7th October was just one attack, but I'm sure there is a lot more background to it. Why don't you throw some light on what's really being the background behind all of that?
Maulik, some of my views are in the sense that it's published. Some of your views are not published. Some of the views are what I would call private. But if you check from the page, we were very quick off the box to basically identify what I call the superpower sponsor behind Hamas. And the research team that is there had been tracking this actually for about, I would like to say several months, because obviously the planning took several months. But they became aware of it, and I became aware of it for about 5 or 6 prior to the attack. And by about 2 or 10 days before the attack, it was very clear there was very sophisticated basically very sophisticated involvement with Hamas, especially with the provision of snoop capability, of interception capability, interception of signals, etc., were concerned. And which is why when the day they attacked, Yom Kippur, if you remember, the 73 war was on Yom Kippur. Anwar Sadat launched that war on that day because Israelis celebratory mood. They were on holiday. It's one of the most sacred dates in the Jewish calendar. So the Hamas was basically given accurate intel that this particular part of the border would be populated by young people, there would be virtually no security, and the security would be minimal, and this is their security. These are their vulnerabilities. These are their guards, and they attacked them with precision, with absolute foreknowledge. Which guard tower, where to go to attack towers, where to go to find the young people, what kind of young people, everything. The entire attack was carried out with the precision of a high-tech military, not a normal terror force. And this, frankly, took the Israeli side completely by surprise. And it did not take me or my team in surprise. We had been tracking it. But frankly, until the actual terror attack, we did not go public with any of our conclusions because we would have been mocked at. And that's been our destiny for some time. Say something, people said the Ukraine war back in, I think, 2014. And I think my social media teams put out an old tweet of mine on 2014 saying that, look, accept the fact Ukraine's a divided country now. It's never going to be, for the foreseeable future, it won't be united. Don't try and do something crazy united. That was in 2014. And now it's 2023, and you can see what's happening. The country is divided. The Russians are hanging on to their territory. There's no way the Ukrainians can make them go away. So as far as, this particular thing is concerned, if I may say so, there was a superpower sponsor. And there are certain other countries, very powerful regional players. I mean, I'm not going to say that they are the governments of those countries. But in Qatar, for example, and in Turkey, for example, there are groups that have been supporting Hamas. Some of the key leaders of Hamas, I think 28 of the key leaders of Hamas, live openly in Qatar. Now, it's difficult to believe that none of these 28 of the top leadership, they were board of directors of Hamas, knew nothing about this operation. And it's difficult to believe the Qataris not have any intel as to what was going on inside the minds inside the conversations, etc., of these 28 people. But I mean, if you look on the surface, that's what happened. So I'd like to say that, one has to keep track and one has to look at the worst case scenario. The problem with us in India, we normally go with basically a law and order mindset. Everything is a criminal investigation. It's a police job. The fact is, a terror challenge is more than a police job. It's a national security job. You have to bring in different elements beyond the police, the normal reasoning of police. Because if you do only that kind of a law and order reasoning, you won't be able to connect the dots of a terror attack. So I'd only like to say that from the Israeli point of view, again, they were taken by surprise because they were not aware of this capability. But I'm surprised that they were not aware of it because it shows that somebody was asleep at the wheel. Because if we were tracking the fact that Hamas was getting intel, Hamas was getting, for example, space intel, spatial, mapping of different of that particular boundary. Hamas was getting, intercepts of people, of conversations. If we were getting that, and it's not very difficult to get that, frankly, with modern technology and enough brain power. I'm surprised that, it was probably there in the Israeli system, but somewhere up the line, somebody thought that this is improbable, it's ridiculous, and would have just disregarded it. It happens to a lot of good intel. At some level, somebody says, oh, this is not true. I'm sure 9/11, people track 9/11. I mean, if I know that several of the people who arrange meetings for me, they genuinely believe that, that this attack was very, very possible. But further up the line, nobody believed it. And in fact, a few weeks before my last visit, and during 9/11, by the way, a few weeks before that, there was a Taliban delegation in George Bush's Washington. and they had met senior officials in the US of the George Bush administration. The Taliban, the very Taliban that harbored the plotters of 9/11, and some of whom would have known that 9/11 was about to take place. So there is a certain, if I may say so, a certain complacency that comes, a certain feeling of security. And I think it's very dangerous to have that feeling. It's always better to be a little humble about capabilities, and always better to keep your eye out for a worst case scenario rather than think that the worst case scenario is outside the realm of the possible.
Got it. You have been very vocal about your views on Russia, Ukraine, and I've seen some of your tweets wherein you actually mentioned that the presence of Zelensky in the G20 itself is a distraction. So where you mentioned that, given that we do have this conflict on the back of 1.5 years of war, which is Russia-Ukraine, is there any linkages one can establish to look at the pattern as to where we are moving on? And I'm also connecting somewhere your Cold War 1.0 and Cold War 2.0, the book that you have just published.
Look, Cold War 1.0 is over. It was between Russia, Soviet Union, and United States. Cold War 2.0 is between the United States and China principally, but I mean, my thesis has been for several years now that it's an inevitable, if I may say so, ratcheting up of tensions between the US and China, just as it was inevitable with the Soviet Union and the United States. So from that point of view, there's an inevitability. Is there a link between the two? I mean, this is hypothetical, but hypothetically, I mean, there's a very strong case for a link because Ukraine, and we know, for example, it was amazing. If you check my writing, you'll see I was surprised even at that point in time that people in the West believe that China could be a peacemaker. China has a direct interest in ensuring the war continues. It diverts US military attention away from Asia. China has a direct interest in ensuring that there are flashpoints that divert NATO attention elsewhere. Should the necessity come politically for the Chinese leadership to launch an attack on Taiwan. So it's obviously in the interest of China to have these flashpoints. So from that point of view, flashpoint 1, the major flashpoint, Ukraine, now flashpoint 2, this Gaza situation. The only thing is that in the Gaza situation, fortunately, I think the Israelis, hopefully, within about 4 or 5 days, the hyper-kinetic phase will be wrapped up. The mopping up phase will begin. And at that mopping up phase, you can ramp up food supplies and you can ramp up a lot of the humanitarian assistance. So the collateral damage will be much less, hopefully. That's what I believe will happen. If the worst case happens and this escalates into a regional conflict, then, frankly, all bets are off, as would have happened in the case of Ukraine, if it had gone into a nuclear conflict, which fortunately has not happened. I've been very clear from the very beginning of this attack, that Iran could not have been behind it. And the Hezbollah chief a few days ago, Hassan Nasrallah, made it clear in his Friday address to the faithful, to the Hezbollah loyalists, gentlemen, there were no ladies in the audience, gentlemen, please understand, Iran was not in any way responsible for this attack. We were not in any way responsible for this attack. That is a very good sign. I mean, it bore out what I had been saying from October 7, that you have got these hot-headed Israeli politicians blaming Iran. It's hot-headed Americans blaming Iran. No, Iran is not interested in this kind of a conflict. Hezbollah is not interested in this kind of a conflict. It knows that Lebanon will be in a terrible way. It's in a terrible way. It'll be in a horrible way if it gets into a conflict. But accidents can happen. Sometimes wars happen by accident. The Second World War happened by the design of Adolf Hitler. The First World War happened as a result of accidents. So sometimes accidents can happen, but but in my view, neither Israel, nor Iran, nor the United States, nor, any country in the world, barring one country, the superpower sponsor, has any interest in a regional conflict. Now, no prizes for guessing who that superpower sponsor is. So there's one country which has got an active interest in seeing this spread into the region, so that the United States and NATO get fully committed there and give them complete freedom to act in East Asia. But I don't believe any other country has any interest in this, and I don't believe Hezbollah has any interest. I don't believe Hezbollah knew about this attack. I don't believe Iran knew about this attack, much less plan it. And that's why I'm very glad Prime Minister Modi reached out and had a good long conversation with President Raisi, in which he made it clear that civilian casualties are wrong wherever they take place. And when President Raisi said, stop the fighting, Prime Minister made it very clear that the situation has to be created where you have freedom from fear, freedom from terror. And that has to come into effect as soon as possible. And of course, he agreed completely with President Raisi about the need for humanitarian assistance. And he told President Raisi, it's very important that every country avoid any action that promotes escalation of the conflict. In other words, code for enter the conflict on behalf of any of the parties. I think the Prime Minister was very explicit about that. I think it was a very useful conversation with Ibrahim Raisi. And I'd like to say that my calculation is, based on the data that I have, and my team has got crunching of numbers and sequencing of events. We don't think that that there is likely to be an escalation, provided the Israelis can wrap up this hyperkinetic phase in the next, I would say, 4 or 5 days. If they take more than that, the public pressure to do more may become more intense in Lebanon, in some, especially. Then Hezbollah may try something which may be crossing an invisible red line. Then it will do something which crosses some red line of theirs. Then something may happen to cross a red line of Iran. The whole thing may go out of control. But my own expectation is the next 4 or 5 days, the hyperkinetic phase of the IDF will end. And if you look at this Sunday Guardian, I did say you're going to see the most intense fighting now in the coming 4 or 5 days. And I think we're seeing very, very intense fighting because the IDF knows it's got a limited window for this hyperkinetic phase. And it absolutely has to allow more humanitarian assistance in. It cannot, treat the Gazan people as, basically irrelevant to the conflict at hand.
And that brings to an interesting point about where does India stand? Because, and I'm connecting that with an UN resolution where India abstained from voting, and that made a UN cry in Indian politics, and where there were comments from the oppositions criticizing the government stand. Your views on that, sir?
Look, I'd like to say that any politician who equates Hamas with the Palestinian people or with the people of Gaza, who are also Palestinians, are actually insulting the Palestinian people. Just as those who equate terrorism with a particular religion are insulting the people of that religion. Terrorists do not belong to any religion, and Hamas is not representative of Palestine. So please understand that this is not, this was not begun by the Palestinian people. It was begun by a terror organization that is covering itself in the camouflage of the Palestinian people, and then in the camouflage of a very great religious faith. And in that, unfortunately, Israel under Netanyahu played into their hands, because obviously the planning had been going on for several months. I'd like to pretend or say to you that, look, we knew about this months ago. The fact is, no. As I said, 4 or 5 weeks ago, we started getting straws in the wind, hints, some deductions, more data points. And in the last 8 or 10 days, we started getting clusters of data points. But otherwise, no. But this would have been going on for at least 5 or 6 months, this kind of an attack. So that kind of planning, etc., that has taken place. Basically, I'd like to say that, the reality is Hamas is very happy when there are civilian casualties. They want a situation to be created in which there is anger all over the world at the IDF operation, but then they want the IDF to stop before anything major is done to their military wing. If you look at my writing, I've always said that, ending the military wing of Hamas. I don't believe you can get rid of Hamas as an ideology. You can't get rid of an ideology at all. But the military wing, yes, you can destroy the military wing. That in the next 4 or 5 days, I think the Israelis will succeed very reasonably in breaking the back of that military wing. So it's very important for Hamas to get a ceasefire. For that, they're now cloaking this as a religious conflict. It is not a religious conflict. And as a consequence of their becoming, cloaking, the Israelis have made the mistake. First of all, in the West Bank, that's territory that should be administered by the Palestinian Authority. And you have these Israeli settlers supported by the Netanyahu government setting up illegal, home sites there. It's completely wrong. For many of the people in Netanyahu's coalition believe in a single state solution, that the Palestinians should be driven out and the entire, what is left of undivided Palestine should be Israel. It's not going to happen. Just as those on the Palestinian side who believe that Israel should be eliminated, people like Hamas, for example, it's delusional. It's not going to happen. Neither Palestine nor Israel is going to cease to exist on the map. So from India's point of view, we are friends with both. And as for the abstaining, we would not have abstained if the Canadian resolution had been carried forward, which condemned Hamas as a terror organization. This particular resolution did not condemn Hamas. It basically condemned Israel. Now, let's say, for example, you had, 26/11 in Mumbai, and you have a resolution condemning the Mumbai police, and you have the commandos who came in that particular operation. I don't know if you were in Mumbai during those horrible days.
I was.
I was not, I would like to say. But the fact is, and then allow the ISI to get away. It's as absurd as that. So if that Canadian resolution had been carried, and the Trudeau government is not the best friend of India, but that resolution is a good resolution. Prime Minister Modi wisely decided, along with EAM Jaishankar, an outstanding individual who was giving great support to Prime Minister Modi, to support that resolution. Had it been supported, I'm sure we would have voted. But if you don't even condemn the terror organization, how can you support that organization, that kind of a resolution? I think that's why, at the same time, India did not want to go against its friendly countries, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Bahrain. These are all very good friends of India. Iran, good friend of India. Iraq, friend of India. We didn't want to go against them by voting against the resolution. So I think abstaining was the right decision to take in view of the fact that the condemnation of Hamas was not there. And there was no time limit to the ceasefire. In other words, they were saying what Hamas wanted to happen. Israelis should stop. Largely intact.
Yeah. I'm going to pick few points from the chat box, Professor. And looking at the sensitivity of the issue, I'm also mindful of the fact that these are all individual expressions. While they have expressed their view, and I'm just going to put it up to you. There is a comment by Mudit Jain. I don't believe Mossad had an intelligent failure. My conjecture is that the attack was used as an excuse by Netanyahu to declare war on Palestine. You want to respond to that, sir?
Look, Gaza is a densely populated area. Americans will tell you after the experience of Somalia, as the Israelis will tell you after the initial experience of occupying Gaza, it's very different to deal with a densely urban area than it is to deal with relatively open spaces. can't believe that any Israeli government would have wanted to launch this kind of attack, especially at a time when there was so much of, if I may say, political unrest in Israel. Today, as a result of the attack, Netanyahu's popularity has further fallen, if I may say so. And it has further fallen because of the intelligence failure. So I'm sorry, Mr. Jain, I mean, there may be data points somewhere that on which, is right. But I would like to stand by my own, team and our own data points to say very clearly Israelis were taken completely by surprise by this attack.
Got it. There are a few comments, and I'm going to combine them into one point, wherein you talked about this is one way to distract US, NATO into various conflict, be it Russia, Ukraine, be it Middle East, and there could be some interest level where China could be there. And you also have talked about PRC and US as Cold War 2.0. How do you see this unfolding going forward? And I'm combining questions from Ira, Shikhar, they have all talked about who is the interested party behind all of that, and do we really see anything of that sort getting unfolded in time to come?
I'd like to say that it's very clear which country would gain from a complete transfer of US and NATO interest away from East Asia. Which country would gain? Which country is a superpower? Which country is a superpower? I think the answer is fairly obvious. I mean, I don't think there would be any prizes awarded for guessing what that country would be. And the advantage to that country of this war would basically be a draining of attention. A draining of attention to, if I may say so, theaters, which to that country are secondary. Ukraine is secondary theater to that particular country, what I call the superpower sponsor. And certainly it's neither concerned with Israel nor with Palestine, really. It's a secondary kind of theater. And so from that point of view, I mean, these conflicts that drain away attention, should they be a political necessity? And I'd like to say very clearly, the leader of that particular country has just got into an unprecedented third term. Now, that country's politics being what it is, you need a fourth term and a fifth term if you want to remain not only, in power, but out of jail or possibly, a much worse fate. So from that point of view, in this term, he has to do something spectacular to ensure that he has sufficient, support. And even if it's an authoritarian state, it's important to have public support. And don't forget that dictators, whether you have Stalin or whether you have Mao or whether you have all these dictators, or I'm sorry to say, there's a certain dictator in Germany, they had immense public support, which is why everybody was predicting tomorrow they're going to fall, day after they're going to fall. They never fell. So public support is very important. So in case the economy is doing badly, in case there is some public unrest, in case you need a diversion, then a spectacular military victory could be that diversion. And in that spectacular military victory, you'd like to make sure there's minimal external interference. And you have these flashpoints created that will drain away attention and bandwidth. So you have less bandwidth to basically contend with. So that is if I may say so, the explanation behind that particular interest.
Wouldn't that be the single biggest? Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be the single biggest risk one can foresee?
I would say that an invasion of Taiwan would be a calamity far bigger than the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and bigger than certainly much bigger than the Hamas IDF war, definitely. It would be very destabilizing to global security, which is why I am a strong supporter of the Quad. It was begun by Shinzo Abe and Narendra Modi. I'm a strong supporter of that. I do believe that there should not be that kind of a war. I do believe Taiwan should not be attacked. It's very important for the rest of the world that Taiwan not be attacked. Whether it's in the field of microchips or in so many other fields, Taiwan is a knowledge superpower. It's an essential part of the first island chain. If Taiwan goes, Japan is at risk. South Korea is at risk. Philippines is at risk. Vietnam is at risk. Right down the Indian Ocean, if I may say so, we are at risk. The Indo-Pacific, right up and down the Indo-Pacific, we are at risk. The only way is deterrence. The world failed to recognize the threat in the 1930s from a particular individual in Germany. They did not take his views seriously. They did not take his intentions as clearly as they should have. Deterrence was not built up until it was too late. We should not allow that mistake to happen. We have to build up our deterrence in such a way that that particular superpower does not attempt a takeover of Taiwan. This is not my book, Cold War 2.0. The first book was brought out in August of last year. This book was brought out in September of this year. There are two bookends. The first talked about the need for India and the US in particular to work together, tracing Indian foreign policy. It's called 75 Years of Indian Foreign Policy, brought out by Rupa. This is Cold War 2.0, which gives a rationale behind that initial book. So the idea is not to start a war. The idea is to prevent a war. And the only way you can prevent a war is by understanding the threats and having a deterrent force to meet those threats. It's senseless to say, oh, we don't need anybody else. Or, China is the enemy, America is the enemy, US is the enemy, Britain is the enemy, everybody is my enemy, I'm all alone. No, we are not all alone. And the Quad is proof that we are not all alone. The fact that in the G20 we could pass a unanimous resolution, the Russians played a very key role, by the way. At the last, frankly, the role of, at the summit level, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. President Putin, I think, prevailed on Xi Jinping to agree to a unanimous resolution. Biden prevailed on some of these European countries who were opposed to, a treaty that did not, a declaration that did not mention Russia. But ultimately, we succeeded because we are very clear which side we are on. We are on the side of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. We are on the side of democracy. And we have seen that in action in the G20, and we have seen that in action in the Quad. So I'd like to say the purpose of deterrence is not war. The purpose is to avoid a war. But a war between the PRC and Taiwan would be a catastrophe far, far worse than anything that we have seen, in this century. Anything.
Well noted, Professor. I also wanted your views and insights on one of the recent tweets and the interview that you gave on the InfoWar, TikTok in America, how it is really influencing the views of the youth Americans, where they have already started being anti-Israeli, which is unprecedented. Your views on that, sir?
Maulik, again, if you check back my writing, you'll see for some years now, I've been warning about the fact that the internet space has been invaded by a hostile entity that is very, very good at using the internet to widen society so that the extreme fringes get empowered and the moderate middle gets weaker. A healthy society is where the moderate middle is strong and the fringes become weaker. When you have internet chat rooms in which the fringe conversations become more and more, hate-filled, and you start hating the other. The one hates one hates the other, whether it's black and white, whether it's Democrat and Republican, or X or Z, what is X or Y. It's unhealthy for that society. And I think right from about 2019, I've been writing about it fairly openly, about the way in which the internet is being used to widen fault lines in two democracies in particular, India and the United States. So that is something we need to watch out for. internet space. And we need to watch out for the fact that, an effort is being launched to create hate, because social stability, the destruction of social stability, and people talk all the time. Chanakya made it very clear, if I recall, that in Chanakya, that the first thing to do before you wage war on an enemy, destroy the inner coherence of the enemy society. Destroy the monarch and the people, between the government and the people. Make the people hate each other. And what has been happening in our interests, not only do we feel the country that is doing this mischief is actually a friend, harmless, no long-term threat, we are taught to hate our own country by getting curated chats. And you have algorithms specially created in which the worst elements come to the surface. Let's say, for example, you have, let's say you or me. Let's say, for example, somebody writes an algo in a particular, internet search engine that make the worst comments made about you. Then anybody who searches for us on the net on that platform will see a horrible side of us, which may be 99% accurate, and the good side, you have to dig deeper and deeper, which nobody does. So algo writers, what I call the Sino-Wahhabi lobby, and the America, the Sino-Wahhabi and the Sino-Russian lobby, have been very active in generating the situations in which those whom they don't like, they create those in which a lot of negative things come about those people. Those people whom they like, who may not be good for the country, a lot of good things come about those people. So this is war is not just kinetic. War is also, as you said, info war, and unfortunately, is not only is lost info war completely. Today, the whole world believes it's an attack on the Palestinians, and it's an attack by Israel. They've forgotten about the Hamas attack. They've forgotten that Hamas does not represent Palestinians in any way. And that is because of the success of the info war, which the superpower has been waging for quite some time. And what you're seeing on US campuses is a result of that war. And it's not only in the US, I can tell you, it's there in other democracies as well.
Yeah, I mean, you already are seeing 51% of American youth becoming anti-Israel and somewhere supporting Hamas, not really knowing or getting any inputs or informations on what really the truth is. So that's really where we are in terms of the social media impact. And I remember you mentioned in one of your tweet, and I was just reading it, that one of the things that Gaza people or Palestine need is freeing from Hamas. And that's really where, they probably will see their own peace and prosperity returning. So well noted, sir. I'm going to pick again few comments from the participants. They've been very, very active on the chat box. And Rajiv Tanna, while he wrote earlier, do you see any major escalation out of this Israel-Hamas war with the whole of Arabian world getting sucked in? Professor, you can choose to respond.
Look, I don't believe the Arabian world wants to get sucked in. I don't believe that at all. I don't believe Iran wants to get sucked in at all. If it's something accidental happens, I'm not, but I don't believe anybody. So it depends on the IDF. If they can complete the hyperkinetic phase of breaking back of the military wing of Hamas in the next 4 or 5 days, yes. But if this hyperkinetic phase goes on for much longer, the pressure on and the pressure of public opinion is going to be very intense. And that is going to lead to a lot of problems in different countries. I don't think Israel is going to stop the war. They will continue it. But I think it will, in more than about 4 or 5 days more, to continue this hyperkinetic phase before, if I may say so, global patience runs out, because the citizens of Gaza are suffering indescribably from this particular war. And frankly, they never, there was a mock election, that's true, which everybody quotes. But the fact is, the citizens of Gaza cannot be, they're not Hamas at all. And many of them understand the reality of Israel. and as many in Israel understand the reality of the Palestine. Well, one of the problems in Netanyahu government, you've got people there who do not recognize the reality of Palestine. And that is why a majority of the Jewish people all over the world are not very happy with Mr. Netanyahu, because he denies Palestine. And then you have, in the Palestinian side, people who deny Israel. So both sets of deniers are wrong, if I may say so. I am optimistic that the IDF will prevail. There's some pretty smart people there. It's a very effective force. But I'd like to say that I wish it prevails as soon as possible, because I'd like to see the mopping up phase begin, so that you can have a flow of humanitarian assistance, because the people of Gaza are going through indescribable hell, and every second of that hell is 1 second too many.
Yeah. There is also a comment by Pankaj Rathi, which we talked about earlier. The country is allocating more to the defense budget, and you already spoke on that. Yes, you will require a smart defense spend, and maybe there could be, in a way, an opportunity for Indian export sector. But yes, the fact is that the money is getting diverted, if I may say so, from one way of productive healthcare, education, to something like as defense budget. But it's a topic for some other webinar. I will reserve that.
I'd like to say, Maulik, that if you have better healthcare, it helps your defense. If you have better technology, it helps your defense. So the defense budget is one thing. We are mistaking defense for a completely kinetic war, in which you've got guns and tanks and aircraft and naval ships. You have got healthcare systems are part of defense. Agriculture systems are part of defense. All this is part of defense. Technological systems are part of defense. Space systems are part of defense. So overall development promotes defense. So let's not put defense in a small box. Let's try and break it out of that box and put defense in the wider context of the kind of war that's being waged now, a war across several fronts. And each of those fronts has got to be strong.
Got it. And that's a very expanded or enlarged context. And thanks for adding that context, Professor. I'm going to pick one more. Ashish Balsara, we already talked about it. Can we see so we are facing a new Cold War in different fronts. Is Israel repeating the same mistakes in Gaza Strip that US has done in Afghanistan? I think you talked about it somewhere in your initial remark. Venkatesh S, he is the co-founder of RM Next Session from Siemens, and he has a comment to make, an observation. When you mention you may have been mocked for bringing out the risk of a Hamas attack, you are bringing out the dilemma that is faced by every risk manager whenever he brings out a risk that has not materialized ever before. So thanks for contributing that. And we saw comments from Ira, Shikhar, which we talked about it. In kudos of his, I'm just going to read this. Shikhar, inability to let go of the past continues to be the primary reason for majority of the geopolitical conflict. Yes, very well said. We pick any of the instances, be it current, India, Pakistan, Russia, Ukraine. Even you mentioned moderation. Inclusivity and strong actions against extremism and terror are essential for any country to be prosperous. Well said. How can these values be imbibed as conceptual cultural shift to the nations to move towards being prosperous? Sir, your comment.
Maulik, I'll just make 2 quick points, because first of all, about Afghanistan, the Americans, the Taliban was the enemy. And soon after, they went in and they defeated the Taliban with the help of the Northern Alliance, which was anti-Taliban. They started relying on Pakistan for advice on how to defeat the Taliban. Now, Pakistan has had a vested interest in keeping the Taliban going. So the Pakistanis would identify ex-Afghan as a good chap. Ex-Afghan was anti-Taliban, was Taliban. So he was a good guy. And Y Afghan, who was anti-Taliban, oh, he's a bad Afghan. So the US would go after the chap who was anti-Taliban and support the guy who was pro-Taliban. So the Taliban was essentially funded by the United States by listening to misinformation from Pakistan. So risk management, make sure your information source is not tainted. Make sure it's not disinformation and misinformation. That's very, very important. That's what happened in Afghanistan. I don't think that there is a similar risk of the IDF making that mistake in Gaza. I mean, provided it's a limited conflict. But where Iran is concerned, of course, there's a lot of emotion. And I have always got the view, when you have emotion come into play in any kind of a thought process, outcomes actually become less optimal than would be the case if there was no emotion entering into it. So far as moderation is concerned, please check something I wrote in the Times of India in the 90s, Hindutva, INDUTVA. And I'd said very clearly that the DNA, the cultural DNA of every Indian is a compound of the Vedic, the Mughal, and the Western. And, of course, RSS Satsang Chalak, Dr. Bhagwat, has said the same thing, that this is the cultural DNA of all three. And the reality is, Maulik, we can't forget any of these segments. You can't just say that the Western segment is important, the other two are unimportant. You can't say that one, the Mughal segment is important, the other two are unimportant. You can't say the Vedic segment is important, the Western and Mughal are unimportant. No, all three form a seamless fusion. And we have to understand that India is strong because of the fusion of the Vedic, the Western, and the Mughal.
Yeah.
That, if I may say so, that fusion is what I mean by moderation.
Absolutely. Well said, sir. I want to actually couple of points, couple of comments I want to cover. We have exceeded the time, sir. Are you okay? Another 5 to 10 minutes exceeding the time.
Fine. Okay, Maulik, go ahead.
So I will just go ahead with few more points. One is what Shikhar wrote about, which was very important, but I would just pick your thoughts. Connected with that is your recent comment wherein you talked about world of collaboration and cooperation versus Cold War and conflict. And this point from Shikhar, where he talked about how can these values be imbibed as conceptual cultural shift for the nation to move towards being prosperous. Your thoughts, sir?
Look, I'd like to say that, if you go back to, the Hitopadesa, for example, the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is from the Hitopadesa. Hitopadesa is not taught in our schools. It should be taught in our schools. The Greek schools teach Greek epics. European schools and American schools teach Greek epics. We don't teach our own epics because they're considered religious. They're not religious. They are cultural. Yeah. And if I may say so, you go back sufficiently. You go back the last 4,000 to 6,000 years of Indian history. You pick out the gems of that 4,000 to 6,000 years. And believe me, you'll get that. But the problem is, if you legitimize only one part and try and delegitimize the other, you have a problem. And in my view, if we teach the entire history of India and you rely on the entire treasury of, if I may say so, books that we have in India, stretching over thousands of years, the Hitopadesa, for example, the Panchatantra, for example, this should be, we read Aesop's fables. Why not the Panchatantra? And I think it's high time we basically understood that that DNA is there in the literature, right going back to ancient times. So I think it's important to ensure that our syllabi reflect the fact that we are a culture of 5,000 or 6,000 years at least of antiquity, and instill that sense of pride in that culture. Because believe me, that will also be a very important motivation for success. If you feel you come from that kind of a background, you're more impelled to have success. If you've got parents who encourage you to succeed, you're more motivated to success. Then if you have parents who say, one of the problems that are being faced by, I have lectured at several American universities, and, the problem is the parents have an attitude that, all right, he's my kid or she's my kid. No matter what, she's still my kid, no matter what. No, there's no matter what. You have to, there are certain, if I may say so, guardrails, certain standards, certain metrics. And I think over the last, I don't know how many, decades or generation, those guardrails have become weaker and weaker. With the result, anything goes. And that's why on US campuses now, even on the so-called universities, anything goes, even if it's frankly harmful to their own country and their own civilization.
I think so. There are questions still flowing in. I really want to thank each and every one of you. I have questions from Rao sir, Anurag Goel, Apura Bookseller, Rajiv Tanna again. I mean, I can see your enthusiasm and I really appreciate, but I definitely want to end here, given that we have exceeded the time, on this wonderful comment that Professor has made in the end. And for all you know, India could lead currently, the way situations are globally. India could be the leader in bringing this cultural shift that, Professor, you talked about. I really want to thank you, sir. It has been extremely insightful, wonderful interacting with you. Definitely, you can make any closing remarks. So we have the audience participants. Sir, I want to leave it with you.
I just remark, China got the maximum benefit from Cold War 1.0. It's today 5 times the size of the Indian economy. We were roughly equal in 1980, if I remember. We can do what China did in Cold War 1.0, Cold War 2.0. We need the right mix of policy, and frankly, we need to take advantage of the right opportunities. In India, the word avsarvad has got a bad connotation. The word tyag has got a very good connotation. But the reality is that, opportunity is something to be taken advantage of. And if you take advantage of it, and if you ensure that you basically, create wealth, prosperity, you can distribute that wealth across the world. The way, for example, India distributed vaccines across the world through Vaccine Maitri. We are not a very well-off country. But despite all that, while rich countries ordered their vaccines, we distributed our vaccines. And they were much lower cost vaccines. Today, is no longer a problem because of generic Indian vaccines. A lot of them produced, for example, companies like Cipla. So let's be honest. Cold War is a tremendous opportunity for India. Let's not make the mistake of ignoring it. The way the Chinese grabbed the opportunity of Cold War 1.0, let's grab the opportunity of Cold War 2.0.
Fantastic, sir. Thank you so much once again. Indeed, a pleasure interacting with you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. And thank you all of you for staying till late. Thanks once again.
Dhanyavad.
Dhanyavad.